Good morning and welcome back now to the reading of God's Word. We begin this week now in the book of Numbers. And to set this up, God has already brought them now through the Exodus, across the Red Sea. They have been at Mount Sinai now for a year. And in that year's time, He has given them all of His instructions. Brother Tim just went through that in the book of Leviticus, a lot of laws, festivals, offerings, and how they were going to live, the laws that He had given them. Plus, He had set up the tabernacle. In chapter 40 of Exodus, the tabernacle was set up for the first time. And so they had this center place here, this focal point for the nation of Israel. And so God is working with them at this point. He is getting ready now to move them out from in front of His holy mountain. So we see right away here in chapter 1 now of Numbers. And we see that first is, it begins with on the first day of the second month of the second year. The tabernacle has just been set up, and here we see God spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting. So this would be now, from now on, where God would speak to Moses. Because why? Well, they're getting ready to move from God's holy mountain. In other words, from Mount Sinai, they're getting ready to move north, and they're going to wind up going up to the Negev and area and to the wilderness of Paran, or the wilderness of Zin, where Moses would wind up sending the spies up into Canaan. We know that's not going to work here, but we're not there yet. So we have this set up, and then we get into the rest of chapter 1. Chapter 1 is the numbering of the tribes of Israel. Now notice just a couple of things, that they don't number the tribe of Joseph. Obviously Joseph's tribe is not there, but they do number Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's sons. So the other thing they don't do is they don't number the tribe of Levi. Levi is being separated. We'll get to them in chapter 3. But we have now the numbering of the tribes, and we see that there's a little over 603,000 men able to go out to war. And that is a significant thing, because God's going to move them into Canaan. And obviously Canaan's not going to give up their land without a fight. But God has already promised Israel that He's going forward with them, and He will fight their battles for them. So He intends to bring them in. So then we move into chapter 2, and we see positioning. Go through all that reading in chapter 2. Basically what you have is three tribes to the east, three tribes to the west, to the north, and to the south, with the tabernacle itself being the center. This is a very basic military defensive position, formation kind of a thing, where basically you got all sides covered in case of an attack. So that's just basic military 101, is to protect your flanks and your forward and rear guard. In number 2, it is also an order of movement. The movement of certain tribes will move out first, then the tabernacle, then certain tribes will come in behind that as they move. So it is an organized movement. And thirdly, and probably most important, it puts all of the tribes in general proximity of the tabernacle. Why is that? So that, number 1, there's going to be an alarm system, or a communication system. We'll get into that when we talk about the trumpets that will be made. And it gives them the opportunity to move between their tribal areas to the sanctuary, to the tabernacle, to make their offerings and their sacrifices. It would not be too far for any of the one tribes to make it over to the temple. So there's several reasons for that positioning in chapter 2. So we move on to chapter 3, and it's the place, of course, of the Levites, which is in the center of the nation of Israel, covered around on all sides by all the tribes. And there's a long discussion there about the tribe of Gershon, Kohath, and Merari, really. In verses 25 through 37, we see where all of those tribes are given duties. Each tribe has a specific set of duties. Korah has all of the holy objects to move. They have to carry them manually. The other tribes have basic everything to do with the tent itself, the tabernacle itself, and all the other major furnishings that go with that. So that's given there when you read up in chapter 3. So we move to chapter 4, and it's about the priesthood. Aaron and his descendants are now given the priesthood, and they're given the other duties. They talk about some of their duties with the holy objects. Notice that later on, and I'll bring this up now, but we'll hit it in a little while. Chapter 16, Korah, who is the great-great-grandson of Levi, he is going to wind up challenging Aaron and Moses for the priesthood. That's a discussion a little bit later, but just notice that right now. And in chapter 5, now we sanctify the people. God moves towards sanctifying the people, and he particularly lists 3 things. One is those who have leprosy, the other one who has bodily discharge, bodily fluid discharge. That's something to be taken care of, and touching a dead person. So he goes through the discussion here in verses 1 through 10 for cleansing these particular things that will defile the people. So he's sanctifying them from that. And then when we get into it, as far as touching a dead person, in a little while we're going to get into the red heifer, where the heifer is burned and the ashes put in water, and they're sprinkled to cleanse them. It's the cleansing of sin from the touching of a dead person. So, and then we go into, and finally in chapter 5, we finish up in verses 11 through 31. And that is a long discussion about the infidelity of women if they're suspected by their husbands of adultery or fornication. There's an issue going on there, a long discussion there about what happens to the woman herself, and to find out whether she has done the offense, and second, if she's lying about it. And this should stand, after seeing and reading all of this would be, to me, if I were one of these women, I'd say just stay away from that. Don't go there. That's going to be too much trouble, and you're going to get caught anyway. And that would be a message, too, for our own daughters, and even in this day. Save yourself for the right person. So we go through that in verses 11 through 31. Then we move on to chapter 6, about the Nazirite vow. The Nazirite vow now is very important. And be very careful as we read this. The Nazirite vow to God is a promise to God that you're going to dedicate something. So a man could dedicate himself or part of his possessions or all of his possessions to the service of God. But he has to make sure that he has every intent to keep that vow. Do not break your vow to God. That is almost as bad as breaking the Sabbath. You just don't make a promise to God. Remember, Jesus said, let your yes be yes and your no, no. Don't go making statements that you can't fulfill. So this is a part of that vow situation. And in verses 24 through 26, then we see the Aaronic blessing. This is for Aaron and all of his descendants to bless the tribes of Israel down through the ages for their faithfulness, as long as they're faithful. So that's just a statement right there of the Aaronic blessing. We move on into chapter 7. This is pretty much some straightforward reading as well. What we have is all of the tribes of Israel now bringing certain objects of silver and gold, and there's some oxen and carts, all brought for the service of the tabernacle and in support of the Levites. So all of this reading that you go through there is kind of repetitive. Each tribe bringing certain things, the same items, all of them are bringing to support then the tabernacle. And then notice right there in verse 89, God spoke to Moses from the mercy seat between the 2 cherubim. This is going to be then, from then on, as long as they have it, will be where God travels with Israel on their journey, and that's where he speaks to Moses. Because why? Because we said a while ago, they're not going to be at that mountain. So God will not call Moses up on the mountain anymore. He's going to go to that tent of meeting for for his communications with God. And that's where God will travel with them because of the cloud and the fire that would be over the tabernacle during the movement, during the times they are in camp, everything. So God was be with them right there at that point. And in chapter 8, finally, we see the setting apart of the Levites, and all the Levites, the priest, were cleansed. They were shaven completely, all the body hair taken off of them, sprinkled with water. There were some sacrifices given for them. The laying on of hands, kind of like we do in our own priesthood now, when we do deacons, or we do the laying on of hands, even for sick people sometimes. But anyway, so we've got now the sprinkled water and the sacrifices given, laying on of hands, Aaron's dedication. Finally, Aaron and the priest and the continuation of the priest are dedicated to the service of God. And in verses 24 through 26, notice this point right here. The age of the service is 25 to 50 years old. Why is that? Well, you've got to have a certain amount of time to be trained, and then you have your time of service, and then they are overlooking after that, though they're not the primary anymore, but those coming up behind them. It's the next generation of priests coming up that start their service at 25 and moving through. And does it make sense then that they, to train up the next generation, what does Proverbs 22:6 say? It says, train up your children in the way they should go, and when they get old, they will not depart from it. This is very important in the Levites, because they're supposed to be the experts in the law of God. So we needed that training, and that service is very, very important. So that brings us from chapters 1 through 8 here in Numbers, and we're going to continue this week as we go all the way through chapter 24. So pray that God gives you the insight when you read this, and the understanding and discernment for what God is doing as he prepares Israel to move forward. And may God bless the reading of his word.